Okay, today my guest is Professor José de la Torre. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about José as a person, Professor de la Torre is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor de la Torre is an AIB fellow, as well as a fellow of the SMS, the Business Association for Latin American Studies, and the International Academy of Management. He has published over 60 books and articles and more than 30 case studies in international business and strategy on the management of multinational firms, the relationship between corporate strategy and government policy, and on foreign investment in developing countries. José has served as the president of the European International Business Association and the AIB. He was a member of the board of advisors of the Los Angeles Times and served on the executive committee of the Council of Latin American Schools of Management. He founded and chaired the Latin American Forum in Miami. He received the Distinguished Educator of the Year Award of AOM's International Management Division in 2013. Thank you, José, for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Douglas.
First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, it depends on when you start counting as a child. But when I was a teenager, I really wanted to be an aerospace engineer. And I used to build rockets when I was 14, 15, and shoot them off the roof of our house, of our apartment building, which of course created all kinds of problems. And I had this expectation that maybe I could be an astronaut. You know, I really wanted to be able to build rockets and actually ride them into outer space. So that was my ambition. And as a matter of fact, my first university degree is in aerospace engineering.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Havana, Cuba. And I went to high school there, and I moved to the US to go to college when I was 17 years old. So all of my formative years were in Havana.
And José, how did you choose academia?
I didn't choose it. I just sort of stumbled into it. It's a little of a complicated story, but maybe I'll give you a brief version of it. As I said, I studied aerospace engineer at the Pennsylvania State University in US. And when I was finishing my degree, I started interviewing for jobs with aerospace companies. And I had a pretty good record. I was the president of the AIAA, which was the student chapter of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So I had sort of, a top record, a good leadership potential. I thought I would get lots of offers, but I didn't get any offers at all. And the reason was that the companies saw me as a security risk because I was Cuban born, you see. And this was at the height of the Cold War. This is in the middle, 1964. So the Cold War was actually very hot at the time. And these companies said, I'm sorry, José, we'd love to have you, but it's going to be difficult for us to get security clearance for you, so we're going to pass. And at the end of the season, the interview season, I didn't have a single job offer. I had some job offers, but they were not interesting. They were in companies that had nothing to do with the cutting edge of space exploration, which is what I was interested in. So I did then the most stupid thing I could do is I stayed at school for a master's degree in aerospace engineering and therefore became even less employable. But halfway through my master's degree, I was already almost 3/4 of the way through when I realized that this was a totally hopeless exercise. And I walked over to the business school and I asked somebody, a professor that I got an interview with, I said, is it possible retrain as a business school student. And he said, yes, of course, we would love to have you. And I was admitted to the business school, to the MBA program. And luckily, I was able to do that. So then, I had to take all sorts of basic courses. Like I had to take undergraduate marketing because I didn't know anything about marketing. I had to take a finance course and so on. And then I got into the MBA, and I finished the MBA in 1 year plus the summer. And during that time, I began to interview for company jobs. And here I did a lot better because I was looking now for, business employment. And I got some very nice offers, particularly one from DuPont in Delaware, which was just the ideal offer for me because it involved working in the international department of DuPont. You need to think that at the time, DuPont was organized in a series of product departments, and then there was an international department. And the international department was in charge of looking around the world and identifying opportunities for the various business units of the company. And this was just ideal for me, exactly what I wanted to do. So I went there, interviewed, and I was given a job offer in that department, and I was ecstatic. And the day I got the offer, that same evening, I got a call from the Harvard Business School where I had interviewed for the doctoral program because one of my professors at Penn State had told me to interview for this program. And I had taken advantage of a trip that I did to Boston for another interview, a company interview, to actually go and talk to the people at Harvard. And the guy from Harvard Business School says, congratulations, Mr. De La Torre, you've been admitted to the doctoral program. And I said, oh, really? And what does that entail? And he said, well, we will be able to give you a partial scholarship and we'll give you some loans to cover your expenses. And I said, forget it. There is no way I'm going anywhere where I will accumulate more debt than I have now. I am already very high in debt because, I had to pay for all of my studies. So thank you, but no thank you. And I had this other job that I was very excited about. An hour later, the same guy calls me back and says, Jose, I have good news. Forget the debt. We'll give you a complete scholarship, and we'll give you also a job as a research assistant that will cover all your other expenses. So at that point in time, I was in a very critical dilemma. What do I do? I have a job offer that I really like, and I think it's going to be I could be very successful at it, and it would be just exactly what I had trained for and wanted to do. And then I have this opportunity to go to one of the premier universities in the world to study a doctorate in international business that I really did only as a fluke, if you will, but I will never have an opportunity like that again. So I called my now wife, then my fiance, and I spoke to her on the phone for an hour talking about the pros and cons of this. And at the end of the evening, I said, all right, I will accept the Harvard Business School offer. And I ended up going to Harvard for the doctoral program. But it was, I assure you, it was absolutely serendipity. It was not a planned move, and it just something that happened out of the recommendation of one faculty member who told me to go there. And I never expected to end up in an academic position. It was never in my planning. It was never even in my horizon. I had no expectation of doing that. And here I am, 60 years later or 50 years later.
Wow, this is fascinating. These application packages have these letters about crossroads, and students like to talk about how in a crossroads they are. And no, this is a crossroad. This was a fascinating story.
But I always tell my students, don't overplan your career, because some of the best moves you will make in your career will be opportunistic moves. And if you start planning everything ahead of time, you might miss some opportunities that are going to make a big difference in your life, in both your professional and your personal life.
True. Something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting, even beyond interesting than the ones that you just told.
All right. Something in my CV, I don't know. Well, as I said, I grew up in Havana, and I came to the U.S. and I didn't speak English very well at the time, and I struggled with the accommodation and assimilation into American culture. And one of the things that I did, and this probably made a huge difference in my life, when I was at Pennsylvania State University as an engineering student, I thought I really wanted to get to know more about the culture and the people. So I applied to a fraternity, and I joined a fraternity. And that was a tremendously eye-opening experience, because I was the only sort of foreigner in this house, this fraternity house. And I learned about, what American kids do, young American people like my age, and what their desires, their habits, their accommodation. And I, in a very short period of time, got Americanized. And it was an experience that I, thought at the time it was just, again, serendipitous, but it allowed me to actually blend into and learn about this culture in a way that I would have never been able to do so if I had been on my own as a normal student in the dorms. So I thought that was an eye-opening experience for me.
And you met your wife in Penn State?
No, that's another interesting story. I met my wife in Havana when we were kids. I met her at a party when she was 13 years old, but don't put this out because I could get put in jail for this. She was 13 and I was 16, and we met at a dance party, at a kids party. And we started, we danced together that evening, and then we started talking, and then, we saw each other here and there. And eventually she was my date for my high school prom dance in Havana in 1960. And then, after that, I went to the US to study, and then she and her family emigrated to the US as well. And we met a couple of times in the US, but we sort of got distanced at the time. So time passed, and then it was not until 1964 that I actually started seeing her again in a more serious venue. And eventually we got engaged and got married, and we've been together 54 years now.
Wow, congratulations. I met my wife when she was 16. I was 17 at the time, and we've been together since then. Regrets. Have you got any regrets?
Sorry?
Regrets. What is one thing you wish you would have done or done differently?
Well, I guess the only thing, I've often said this, Ilgas, the only thing I regret in life is not having had more children. I don't regret anything about my career. I think it was ideal. The ability to to have an academic career where you teach and you do consulting and you travel and you live in different countries, it has been extraordinary. But we have two children, a boy and a girl. And when the youngest was about 4 years old, I said to my wife, let's have two more. And she said, no. She said, I want to start my career, and which she was at the time had interrupted in order to be able to care for the children. And she says, I want to start my career. I don't want two more children now because that will impede me from doing this. So this is a family joke that I will tell you now. She says, I said to her, okay, but this time we'll have the children with the nurse. We'll have a nurse. And she said to me, you can have as many children as you want with the nurse, but not with me.
Fascinating. Okay.
But the reason I say I regret is because now in my old age, having access and spending time with my adult children and with the grandchildren is the most joyful thing. And it's really a real great source of joy and satisfaction. And I'm very proud of them. And that's why I said the only regret I have is not having convinced my wife way back that we should have two more children.
Well, I can relate to this one very much. How many grandchildren have you got?
4.
Well, great.
2 on each side.
Perfect. Jose, about research, let's just talk about research. How do you explain your research to people who don't read your work regularly? Say people you run across in a small village, in a city, who are not academicians. How do you explain your research to them, and how do you explain the importance of your research?
Why would I? Why would I inflict such pain on them? I don't know. No, I thought about that question because you asked, how do you explain it? And I don't know. I guess I say what I'm interested in is what happens when you cross boundaries. And, I've become over the years a lot more interested on the personal human aspects of cross-boundary interactions. Remember, I was an engineer, so I thought everything fit in formulas. And that, just if you explain something to somebody, they will understand it. Well, that's not true at all. And the question of sort of trying to interact across cultural boundaries has become increasingly fascinating to me over time. And you ask in your questions, what are some of the things perhaps that we haven't learned in our studies? And I think that's one of them. I think that, I learned to over time and sometimes painfully what the importance of people are to everything you try to do. Any program you start to launch, any activity that you hope to achieve, any program where you need the collaboration of others, the importance of being able to work through people is fundamental to human activity, and particularly difficult for us to cross boundaries because we have to deal with people who come from different mindsets. And how to try to identify the mindset of the person across the table from you is fundamental to getting anything accomplished. And I think that is something that we have never been trained for, and it is something you learn the hard way over many years.
I mean, you've covered a very long time in your career, and you've seen an evolution of the IB field from pretty much the beginning of it. How is this evolution of the IB field shaping up from where we were, and where are we headed to?
Oh, it's when I was first doing international stuff, it was all about multinationals and what they were doing. And, you know, it was the study. I remember I was a student of Ray Vernon at Harvard on the big Harvard multinational study. So I sort of learned from those people who were working there, people like my colleagues, John Stopford and others. At the time, you know, what happened, what were the implications of growing internationally was the fundamental issue people were worried about is what's the impact on both the receiving nation and the source nation. And this was, you know, early 1970s. There was all kinds of issues about whether multinational investment was good or bad. Was it good for the receiving country or was it good for the source country? And we were concerned with those kinds of issues, by the way, which are still relevant today in many contexts. But I guess what we didn't have, and what some of my professors tried to do, and we were not very successful in getting it accepted, what we didn't have was a lot of sort of detailed analytical case studies that allowed us to understand what happens when companies try to interact abroad. And this is why I really admire the work of Edith Penrose, a woman that I came to meet late in my career and who I absolutely adored in terms of her intellect and her ability to understand issues like this. And she was very early on in her famous work on this, you know, on the theory of the growth of the firm. She was very much concerned with the role of management in managing this process of growth and understanding what it took to do it. And she based it on a lot of her analytical work inside companies that she studied for various reasons, both in the US and in Australia, where she spent some time. And I remember a project that I did with Robert Stovall. Robert Stovall, I don't know if you remember the name, he was a professor at Harvard, and he was one of the presidents of the AIB in the 1960s or early 70s. I can't remember exactly when. And Bob Stovall launched a project at Harvard where I collaborated with him on analyzing the impact of foreign direct investment by studying a number of cases. And we looked at a number of cases. I think there were 8 cases. And we had to study in each one of them the impact that that case had had in terms of financial flows, people, jobs, employment, etc., both in the host country as well as in the US where the companies were based. And we had to make some assumptions to track these numbers, obviously, as to what the alternative world would have been like in the absence of the investment. But we published that study in 73, 72, 74, somewhere around there. And it was a detail. There was a number of people working on the project. There was 5 or 6 of us that worked on these cases and analyzed this data. And I thought it was an extraordinarily interesting way of looking at the whole question of what are the impacts of multinational investment by looking at these case studies and extracting from them the detail about job changes and job, what happened in one end, what happened in the other end, what happened to suppliers, what happened to customers, what happened to people, what happened to financial flows, etc. And we reached some conclusions about the value of foreign direct investment, both to the receiving country and to the host country under different circumstances. And that paper or that study didn't get the reception that I expected it would get. And it was disappointing because I thought that's the sort of very detailed clinical analysis that I was trained on for doing, and that I thought would be very important to the field. And in fact, the rest of my academic work is very much based on this sort of methodology, but it's a methodology that is not well accepted in the academic world, and it is one that you need to struggle constantly to get it accepted. The journals, for example, are very suspicious of anything that is based on this sort of very minute micro level analysis.
Well, I mean, we can talk about the current JIBs, and they are changing, obviously. I mean, JIBs under Alain Verwicke has changed quite significantly, and they are now looking into these new methods. My question for this evolution: yes, MNCs were discussed so in detail as you described, but now we have this new isolation, populism, nationalism being brought back or revived, neo-nationalism. Is this going to overtake MNCs and globalization research, or is this going to fade away?
No, I think it's always been there. And you know, remember back in Servan Schreiber wrote The American Challenge, you know, when Europe was concerned about the impact of American investment on the European stage. And that was sort of 60 years ago or more. So the question of the national response to these international flows has always been at the core of political developments in both the advanced and the developing countries. Remember also the impact of what happened when AT&T went into Chile and created all sorts of political trouble there in the 1970s as well. And we had the United Nations trying to come up with a code of conduct for international investment in the 1970s. So this has been with us for a long, long time. And it just sometimes it gains more preeminence. I suppose that in the period leading to the year 2000 on thereabouts, the enormous growth of multinational investment and flows of investment sort of overcame some of the resistance, but then it's coming back now, as you say. And I think the fundamental issue of how to evaluate the contributions of cross-border investment and to both countries' domestic conditions is still a fundamental one. And a lot of it depends on the assumptions that one makes. So it's bound to be still a very controversial field, because what's good for me may not be necessarily interpreted as good from your point of view.
True. Jose, if you could start all over again and write a new dissertation, what would you write about?
What would I write about?
Yeah, what would your new dissertation be?
I don't know. If I had to start all over again, if you asked me, go back to college and start from scratch, I would not do aerospace engineering. I would probably study history. I think there's a lot to learn. I mean, one of my favorite pastimes is to read history. I find it fascinating to learn of what happened in, 300, 400, 500 years ago in different conditions, in different countries, in different situations, and try to learn something from it. And it's amazing how constant these battles are over history, over time. So I think I would start, if I had to start again, I would start reading history. And I'd be very interested also particularly in economic history. What are the conditions that sort of led people to act in one way or another? What were their lives like in the Middle Ages, for example? Charlie Kinderberger, the famous economist at MIT, taught a course that I took when I was in the doctoral program. One of the advantages of being in Boston is you could cross campuses. So I was at Harvard, but you could take courses at MIT if you wanted to. And I did. I took a course for Charles Kinderberger. And I just admired that individual tremendously because he had a really sense of the historical impact that these flows had. And I remember, for example, one class he taught us where he showed us some data that either he or somebody he knew had developed about a market in a town in France, somewhere in the Middle Ages. And then a government official had recorded all of the items that had come into the market that day from the countryside for sale. And then at the end of the day, all of the items that had gone out of the market because they had not been sold. And then also had data on the prices at which these items had been sold. And it was fascinating because here was just a little bit of data from a little tiny village market in the middle of nowhere. And you can get all sorts of interesting insights about what was happening in that market as the day wore on in terms of the prices that were changing as the sellers were trying to get rid of their inventories so they didn't have to carry them back to their own village, to their own farm or whatever. And it was that sort of work that Kindelberger did that was fascinating to me, and that it sort of encouraged me to read more about these kinds of historical events.
Perfect. This was quite interesting. About advice, what was the best advice you received when you were going through the program?
A very poor advice. I hate to say this in a recorded line, but I think that with some very few exceptions, the doctoral program at the Harvard Business School in the late 1960s, which is when I was there, was not a very successful program. I learned more by going across campus to the economics department and taking courses. For example, I took a course with Galbraith at the economics department. I took this course with Kindelberger at MIT. And so I moved out because I found that the courses offered at the Harvard Business School were rather pedestrian, and I wasn't particularly interested in them. So I didn't get very good advice, and I didn't think I was trained very well either. For example, in methodology, I wish I had learned more about more statistics, for example, higher level analysis and methodology, which I didn't learn enough about. So that's part of the reason why all of my work has been very much on a sort of qualitative type, I suppose. But I'll tell you one interesting piece of advice that turned out to be completely wrong that I got, and that was from Ray Vernon himself. When I started working, my first job was at Georgia State University, and we had a great team of people there because it was, John Daniels, Dwayne Kujawa, Jeff Arpen. We were sort of the young Turks, as we would, excusing the expression, at Georgia State, trying to get this Institute of International Business off the ground. And we fed on each other. We were all of us were young. We had just finished our doctoral program, and we were excited about what we were doing. At one point in time, John Daniels left, And then we decided that we really needed a senior person there. So we got a chair offered to us, and we wanted to hire somebody for the chair. And we offered the chair after a lot of interviews to Bob Hawkins, who was then at NYU, and we wanted him to come to Atlanta and to be the leader of the group. It turns out that the dean, in his negotiations with Bob Hawkins, screwed things up, and Bob said no, that he wouldn't come. And at that point in time, because he didn't feel he was going to get the support from the dean, and that was very disappointing to all of us. So then all of us decided, well, this is not going to go anywhere. Let's go somewhere else. So I had this job offer to go to INSEAD in France. So I talked to my advisor, to Ray Vernon. I said, Professor Vernon, because in those days I still called him Professor Vernon. I have this offer to go to INSEAD and work in Europe for a few years. What do you think? And he said, don't do it. It would be a huge mistake for your career, because if you go to Europe, there's not going to be any of the research sort of discipline that you will find in an American university. And consequently, you're not going to do good work, and your career will stall. All right, I thought that was a sort of a very serious piece of advice, and it made me think twice before I eventually accepted the offer, because I thought it was an exciting place to go. And Europe, there are a lot of things were happening. The European community was being put together. There was integration. There were all kinds of cross-national issues that I thought that would be interesting to study. So I ignored his advice and accepted the offer. And it was the best decision I could have possibly made in my life, because I learned so much in the years that I worked in Europe, because of the experience of European companies that were crossing boundaries every day. And, learning, I mean, I did some case writing there. I did some research on how companies dealt with questions of cross-border interactions. And all of that was very, very useful for my own personal as well as my professional development. And I ended up spending 13 years in Europe. And during those years, my career took off. I got a lot of good stuff published. And I met some fascinating people that I worked very closely with. Of course, Edith Penrose being one of them. Yves Dawes being another one. C.K. Prahalad, who used to come and spend time with us at INSEAD. And it was a very growing opportunity for me that I would have not had I stayed in some state university in the United States for the next 13 years. So you got to be careful about advice because you need to put your own priorities in front of it.
Professor De La Torre, now it is your time to give advice to young scholars. And what is your top three advice for junior faculty, young scholars, PhD students?
I don't know. I made some notes about that because that was an interesting question. I don't know. I think that the biggest issue for me that I would give to a young scholar today would be, first of all, do something that you feel passionate about. Select the themes you work on the basis of your interest, not on what is the fashion of the day. So it's passion, not fashion. That is important. Because you're going to be working on this for a long time, and you might as well be interested in it. If you're not interested, you're not going to be able to do good work. The second thing is, I would suggest that you keep a foot in the real world. That whatever work you do, don't just do it in the privacy of your office or the library. but go talk to practitioners. Make sure you actually discuss these issues with people who are dealing with them on a day-to-day basis, because they will inform you of issues in a way that is different from perhaps you would learn it in just reading the literature. And that may inspire you to add different variables to your research analysis, to your research work that will be critically important in being distinctive and getting perhaps some insights into the causality of issues that you will not obtain from just literature review. And so that is very important. The second thing I would think is very important is that something we don't do enough, and I understand why young scholars don't do it because it's very expensive, is you need to do more longitudinal research. The variables, there are two variables. You asked me in one of the questions, what are the variables that are omitted in most IB research? I think the two variables that are mostly omitted are chance and time. I think the thing that, often what happens in the real world is things occur by chance. All of a sudden, something happens that changes conditions, and therefore you move in one direction versus another. Like I said, in my own career, a lot of the things happen by pure serendipity, by chance. And you cannot explain it if you're looking at it from outside. Why did Jose do this and not that? If you don't understand that these opportunities or these chance events occurred. And the other thing is you need to look at time. Time is a critical variable that we have often not given considerable weight in our IB research. What happens as you learn over time? What happens as conditions evolve over time? Let me give you one example. Entry strategy, which is a very big topic in the field. What is the governance structure that you as a company undertake when you enter a new market? Is it, joint venture, licensing, full subsidiary, greenfield investment versus acquisition, etc. All of these kind of variables that we discussed in terms of classic IB literature from the very beginning, from Bucky and Casson on through today. The question that I have often posed and that I have observed in my own work, and particularly in my own consulting work, is that the optimal governance structure changes over time as a function of several factors. One is your own learning about the market in which you are operating. When you first enter a new market, you don't know very much about it, but over time you learn a lot, and consequently your need for certain assistance diminishes, whereas your ability to act independently increases. And the other one is that conditions in those markets also change over time, and they become either better or worse as the time goes on. Political instability rises or declines, economic conditions become fragmented or they become more solid, and you as a firm may want to change the nature of your operating structure there to respond to these conditions changing. So you don't see that if you look at the investments in a certain country at a point in time. You need to look at them over time. So I think those two factors require more attention in our field.
This was fascinating. For the sake of time, last question. What's the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
I don't know. Was it all worth it?
Was it?
It was definitely worth it. I'm very proud of my children, and I'm also very proud of my academic children. So, we all have both, we all have biological children, and we also have academic children, people we have mentored over the years. And I am extremely proud of both of them. And, I'm also very, very sort of satisfied with some of the things that I've done. And I'm also frustrated with some of the things that I wasn't able to do. Let me give you a couple of examples. When I went to UCLA after INSEAD, I was astonished as to how resistant the institution and the faculty were to new international programs. Here is a top-rated business school in the world at UCLA, the Anderson School. And to try to change the direction of the school by adding more international programs and things of that nature was a gargantuan task. And even, I was able to get a cyber grant and I had some money to throw around, tried for a number of years to do this, and the movement was minuscule. So that was a frustrating and a learning experience that you really need to change the culture more than anything else. But I've also been very proud of some other achievements. I mean, this consortium that I now have run for the last 11 years has been a source of extreme pride and satisfaction to me. We now have 12 universities around the world that are collaborating on these programs. And it is so rewarding, Ilgas, to see, for example, when we bring together these executives from Japan, Turkey, Britain, Brazil, South Africa, and put them together for 1 week in a country, not one of these, but in Italy, for example, and they work together for 1 week. And these are people in their late 30s. These are pretty seasoned executives who come in and do this. And it's so fascinating and so rewarding to see them, how they bond very closely right away, and how immediately they begin to share experiences about their life and their frustrations and their successes and failures. And not only they learn about business in Italy when they're there, but they learn about each other. They learn about what are the issues that Brazilians are concerned about, or South Africans are concerned about, or the Russians, or the Japanese, etc. And it is a very rewarding experience that to have been able to pull this together and to have created this opportunity for literally hundreds of executives to do this every year and acquire a deeper understanding of what it takes to be able to succeed in international business. And that was the goal, and it's been a great satisfaction to do that. And that's sort of my swan song, because I'm probably going to be retiring. I mean, I retired already several times, but I'm going to be retiring for real probably next year or the year after. I would be 80 years old. So I am at that point in time, I think it's time for me to retreat to my history books and and spending more time with the grandchildren, as opposed to sort of trying to do real work.
Perfect. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much, Jose.
It's a pleasure, August, and congratulations to you for having done this. It's a wonderful task, and it's going to be great for future people to be able to see some of these interviews.
Thank you.
All the best.